but I'd like to welcome you once again to this series of webinars, the Wider World Teaching Teenagers Webinar Week with Pearson. This is also being recorded today, so you will be able to watch it later on if for any reason you'd like to see it again or you'd like to refer a friend to it. This is the third webinar. This started on Tuesday. Ken began with the webinar on the teenage brain. Yesterday we had Phil Warwick talk about bridging the authenticity gap. Tomorrow there will be a BBC producer and camera person speaking about how they created video vox pops for language learners. And Ken Beatty will be back again on Saturday with a webinar on interactivity, which sounds very interesting as well. Today, it's going to be me, Brian Engquist, and Elena Merino. I'm going to ask Elena to come up on the screen now if she'd like to, so she can introduce herself as well.
All right, yeah. Hello, everyone.
There.
Yeah, okay. I hope you can hear me. And
I can hear you. I can hear you, Elena.
So that means that everybody can hear me. Okay.
I would hope so. We'll hope so.
Yeah.
So let me introduce myself. My name is Brian Engquist, and I'm the Teacher Training Department Manager for Pearson in Spain and Portugal. Elena will introduce herself in a moment. I'll just say a few things about myself. I'm from the United States. I've been living in Spain now for over half my life, which is about 25 years now. In the United States, I lived in the east of the Mississippi most of the time, along the East Coast a lot of my life as a kid, and then moved back to near about Chicago. I lived close to Chicago, across the state line I lived in Indiana for quite a while, and I think Elena also has a little bit of a connection to Indiana, which is quite interesting as well. She could tell you about later. I've been a teacher in Spain of adults and teens mostly for the better part of my 25 years here, and for about the past 7 years I've been working for Pearson in teacher training. And I'll get on and I'll tell you a few other things about me a little bit later, but now I'll just let Elena say a few things about herself before we get started.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Brian. So my name is Elena Merino, and I'm based in Barcelona, Spain. Although I'm from a little town in Spain, but I've been here for around 10 years already, so I feel like this is home. And okay, so I spent some time, well, first in Ireland. I never mentioned Ireland, but I think it's important, okay, in Galway, exactly. And after I moved to the US, and I spent some time in West Virginia, and also in Indiana, so that's how I know that area, and Chicago and all those the cornfields. Well, I've been a teacher for around 13 years already. I've taught teenagers mostly and adults, also for online courses, and what else? Well, I'm a teacher trainer now for Pearson, and well, we'll be giving a wonderful webinar. So I hope you like it. Brian will do the first part, and I'll take over after, and I'll do the second part. Okay. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Elena. See you in a little bit. Elena's going to be changing the slides for me as well. And today, obviously, if you've signed in, you already know what the webinar is on. So today, the webinar we're going to be talking about the idea of assessment for learning. So let's see. Maybe move on to the next slide there. Yeah, assessment for learning. So when we're talking about assessment, assessment. It's a word that I think we all use. We use it quite often. But really, when we think about what is assessment, assessment. How would you define it? Yeah, I mean, there are other words that we might use around this or alongside this word. Assessment's one. There's another word which is evaluation, as well. And I think they're very, very closely related. We're not going to get in today too much to the differences in these types of words, but we know that they're all kind of related. Many people use them differently, with just slight differences of meaning. Sometimes we use them interchangeably. So we talk about assessment, we talk about evaluation. We also talk a lot about the idea of testing. Okay? Now, testing is probably the word that you most associate with, or that most people, lay people, people who aren't teachers, associate with this entire idea. That's the word that would pop out the most from the idea of a test. We all have experience of testing, of being tested, of giving tests as teachers, of being tested. Oftentimes, sitting in rows, not being allowed to talk, writing down on pieces of paper with a time limit going on, told to be quiet. It's very, very serious. Heart poundings in our hearts pounding in our chest. So we know what testing is about, and we're often doing that for a grade. Yeah. So that's one type of testing that we might talk about. When we start talking about these different types of ways of assessing, there's a term that comes up a lot nowadays, which is assessment literacy. Yeah, assessment literacy is the idea of maybe really questioning a little bit and starting to understand what the function of assessment is and what the function of different types of assessment is. For a teacher, being assessment literate is becoming a very important thing nowadays, because there are more types of assessment, and we are starting to see that there's a real value in assessment if it's done properly. And in order to do it properly, you have to understand how and why you're assessing in different situations. Now, I'd like to think that I'm quite assessment literate, because for quite a long time in my career, I found myself in this situation as an examiner, as a speaking examiner for an external exam board. So people would come to me, and I would be there with a colleague, and we would be assessing a couple of students to see if they had reached a certain level of English. And there are some things that are important about to think about here. I mean, one thing, for example, I was very, very aware, as were the students. I was very aware of why they were coming there. They were coming there because they were coming there for certification. What they were looking for was certification, and it was often a very, very stressful process. It was a process that they'd invested a lot of time and possibly a lot of money in as well. So everyone was quite aware of what was going on when we were there. I was also aware of what I was assessing. It was important. They just didn't come in there and simply say, for example, start speaking to me, and I said, well, I think more or less this person deserves to pass. They really tried hard. Or, oh, well, she seemed like a nice girl. I think I'll certify her at this level of English. Yeah, that's obviously not the way it works. What we had were some very stringent criteria. Over on the side here, I have a tick list. That's not actually any kind of criteria, but you would be what you would do is decide if the person had reached a certain level, if they had exceeded expectations, or if they maybe were a little bit below expectations for that level, but around a number of different criteria. For speaking, for example, you'd be looking at things like fluency, obviously, and accuracy. You'd be looking at how their interactive communication, how they talk to one another. You'd be looking at the range of vocabulary, the range of grammar. But even within those areas, you would be looking at other things. So, for example, in terms of language points, for example, or language that they might be using, you might expect certain language from them. You might expect certain types of pronunciation, a certain level of pronunciation from them. So the criteria could be quite general, or could get quite specific as well. So there was quite a bit of criteria involved, and what we were doing basically there was gathering information. Yeah. Now there's a lot about information. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but there's a lot of information out there nowadays. We live in a real information age. But the way I gathered information here was actually quite simple in some ways. I gathered information by listening to the students. It's deceptively simple, because at the same time, obviously, I'm gathering information from them just by listening, but the tasks themselves, for example, were designed to sort of draw out some of the things that we needed to hear from the students. And we were trained to listen for certain types of things. So you were very, very aware of what you were listening for. So gathering information can also go alongside sort of interpreting information as well. We'll just kind of group those together, the idea of gathering and then sort of interpreting the information and the results. And there was one thing that I really didn't do so much in this process, which is it's interesting to point out, which is the idea of using feedback effectively. I did not actually give feedback to these people. They normally receive feedback months later in the form of a letter which would arrive to their homes, addressed to them. They'd open it up and they'd find out if they'd passed the test or not. They didn't get a lot of information about why or why not. They simply found out if they did or did not, or maybe how close they got, but not any real feedback as to why or why not. Yeah, we'll talk about why that is, and a lot of it has to do with the fact that it was certification. So let's see. Today, what we're going to do then, once again, we're going to be talking then about this idea of assessment. So, and types of assessment. So, what types of assessment do we know? We're obviously going to be talking today about assessment for learning. But if we simply change a preposition there, yeah, we actually get another type of assessment which is quite different, which is the assessment of learning. So we're going to be contrasting these two ideas today. Assessment of learning on the left there, and assessment for learning, which is what we want to focus here on today, on the right. Now, assessment of learning. Yeah, assessment of learning is very much like the scenario I just described to you in terms of certifying someone. So you're talking about a test a lot of times where you're getting an evaluation of someone's achievement. Sometimes it's in terms of a letter, an A, a B, a C, yeah, or a numerical value, yeah, as well. So many people are used to those types of assessment as well, where you're given some type of value, yeah. It's often for certification. Sometimes it's also to categorize students, to put students into groups. That could be at the beginning of a process, like a placement test, for example. And it's also known as summative assessment. Okay, so that's one type of assessment. The other type of assessment, if you want to contrast with that, is assessment for learning. Now, this is actually quite different. It's not so concerned with the idea of certifying. It's not really concerned with the idea of necessarily giving a numerical value. So it's not a quantitative thing. It's more of a qualitative thing. That's why we call it something, say it's something that's descriptive. You're trying to describe where the student is and what the student is doing well or not well at the time. Yeah, and it's an ongoing process. This is also incredibly important because you see it as part of a process, whereas assessment of learning, the certifying type, is seen as the end of a process a lot of the times, an end result, whereas the assessment for learning is seen as the process itself. Yeah, and this is also known as formative assessment. Okay, now another way of looking at this, and looking is the key word here, is that assessment of learning is basically backwards looking. Yeah, so you're deciding if a person has completed something. Yeah, if a person has reached a certain level or not. Yeah. Whereas assessment for learning is forward-looking. What we're doing is it's kind of diagnostic in a sense. We're trying to get information so that we can then decide where we're going to be going in the future, what we need to do to get somewhere. And that's a very, very big difference. Another difference would be the idea of stakes. Everyone's aware of high stakes and low stakes poker, for example. Yeah, that idea, that concept. Well, here as well, the idea of assessment of learning. Assessment of learning is quite high stakes. I mentioned before that the students that came to me to be examined had put a lot of time and money into the process. They had a lot to lose in that situation many times. So this is maybe like going as well, like something like getting your driver's license could be quite a high stakes thing. You have to pay for it, and you have to go, and you have to go to the driver's ed school, and then you take this exam, and you might pass it, and you might not pass it. If you do, you're certified, and you have your driver's license. Whereas assessment for learning is low stakes. We're not, what we're doing is we're checking things out as we're going along, and this would be more like your driver's ed class, maybe. You can go in, for example, before you actually get in the car, they're going to make sure that you're not going to make too many mistakes. You might get on a driving simulator, for example, for a while, and you might crash the car a few times in the simulator, but nothing's going to happen. Yeah, you're not going to lose any money. You're not going to crash a real car. Yeah, so that's a difference as well between they're high stakes and low stakes often. So this idea of looking forward, really the idea of assessment for learning is the idea of looking at learning as a learning journey. So we're talking about what does my student know, where are they going, and what do they need to get there. So it's really, more of their needs than anything else. So I'm taking a look at my students, I'm diagnosing where they are, I'm deciding where they need to go on that learning journey. Okay? So going back to this idea, we're going to start off, we're going to talk about these 3 different ideas that I talked about, which are assessment literacy related. The first one was we have to be able to understand what we're assessing and why we're assessing it. Let's look first at the why a little bit. What's the purpose of assessing our students? Well, basically, the purpose is to gather information. Yeah, we want to gather as much information about our students' language proficiency and learning as we can. Okay, and this is kind of a two-way street. Yeah, because I want to find out first of all how they're doing, and they might be asking themselves this question: how am I doing, and why am I doing this way? Why am I doing particularly well or not so well, for example? Probably focusing on the not so well because you want to remediate, you want to correct things that you might not be learning, doing well in order to learn better. But it's also for the teacher. Yeah, the teacher as well has to think, well, why aren't my students getting this concept, for example? Or why aren't they, able to do this task yet? What am I doing here? Why are my students not ready? Maybe I'm not doing something correct. So it's a two-way street. The teacher is asking themselves those questions, and the student as well. And another important idea here is that it's the basis really for a conversation between the student and the teacher. And that's a big, big difference between probably assessment for learning and assessment of learning. Assessment of learning would probably, there's not really any conversation going on there. You get your final grade and that's it. Yeah. But assessment for learning is a time for you to actually speak to your students about why they're doing well or not so well and how you can all move forward together. So I think that's important. Seeing assessment as the starting point in a conversation between teachers and students. Okay? So let's look at this other idea about what we're assessing. Okay? Now, a lot of us as English teachers, we know that we're assessing, it's probably been kind of ingrained in us at this point, we are assessing sort of competencies around sort of maybe descriptors, things, or we often call them can-do statements, things that students can do. And many times we think about this as, well, we also know that we use a framework for this, a framework of reference. The Common European Framework of Reference is really kind of the worldwide standard for this, and students are divided into different levels based on their competency, from A1 up through C2, including sort of like the plus levels, A2 plus, B1 plus, B2 plus. So we understand how this works, but those are very, very broad areas, very broad bands, and I think we all know that it takes a lot of time to get through some of those, like a B1 or a B2. It can take years to get through one of those levels. It's not just something that happens overnight. So we're also going to be talking about another scale here. This is the global scale of English, which is aligned to this. The global scale of English is an 80-point scale from 10 to 90. And the interesting thing about it is that the descriptors in the global scale of English are actually very, very, they're very concrete. They're very, very granular. So, for example, we might have a descriptor which is, instead of being within an entire band of A2, and that's what we'll be looking at today from some of the examples from Wider World 2, which is around kind of an A2 area. Those descriptors can actually be, for example, you can have a descriptor, a writing descriptor of 31 and another one of 33, which is slightly more advanced. So it's a much more precise way of looking at language proficiency, and in that way, it's also a much more precise way of sort of mapping out a journey step by step, if you will. Okay? So let's take a look then at how we can define the learning objectives, because these descriptors that we will talk about are learning objectives. How can we define the learning objectives for each task? Okay, so here's a little thing I'm going to show you here. I don't know if you can see it too well, but if you can take a look at your full screen, yeah, you might want to start thinking of what the learning objective here is. Okay, the learning objective is actually quite clearly described. So if you take a look at it, there is a learning descriptor here for speaking, which is simply, and I don't know if you can look at the next slide. The learning descriptor is something from at the cinema. Yeah, I can buy a ticket at the cinema. So this is the learning objective for this particular section of the course. Okay? So this is a very, very small and very specific skill. Yeah? And that's easier to look at than looking at something very, very broad and very general. Okay? So this is important. Yeah? Because we have to think about why we should share these learning objectives with our students as well. Okay, these things help them to reach their goals. It creates a sense of direction. Students know why they're doing something and what they're doing. They have a goal to work towards. They're much more aware of their own learning responsibility. If you actually tell them what the objective here is, they'll be much more responsible about taking on that responsibility, and they'll be more independent as learners. Now, when should we share those objectives with our learners? A lot of times, I think it's good, because we're talking about the sense of direction. It's good to do this at the beginning of a year, the beginning of a lesson, etc. Yeah, because what we're doing is we're helping them to reach their objectives. Yeah. It could be certification at the end of that road, for example. It would also be things like a job or things like that, but it could be certification. And all along the way, what we should be trying to do is really instill a love of learning. And we're going to instill a much greater love of learning in our students if we give them goals which are achievable, yeah, and step by step. Okay? So, continuing on this idea of how we're going to share these learning objectives with our students, there will be quite a few, for example, within a course. If we take a look at the next slide, for example, we'll see as well that here is another section of a course. Yeah, and one thing that we can do here is actually just simply point out or read this descriptor. Okay, so if we take a look at this descriptor, yeah, I can ask and answer questions, yeah, about habits and routines, okay, is what we have there. And if we want to as well, we might just simply point this out to students, or we could actually have the students predict what they need to do. So they can actually, we may want to cover that up and then have them look at it and decide. There's many different ways of looking at the different objectives. It'd be a good idea to vary how you look at them, but it's always important to make sure the students know why they're doing something. I mean, if you think about it, if someone told you to do something as an adult, anything, I don't know, you would probably, the first question would be why? Why am I going to invest my time in this? Yeah, I know as an adult, as just about any normal person nowadays, my time is quite limited. Yeah, I want to know that I'm doing something for a reason most of the times. So that's something that we have to think about with our students as well. They also want to know why they're doing something, and they have every right to know. This is all that learning objectives is really about. So we can talk about learning objectives, and we can talk about learning outcomes as well. Here, for example, you might think about learning objectives as WALT here, W-A-L-T. We are learning to do something, and the outcome, yeah, what I am looking for in this, specifically. So we know that this was a thing about the learning objective here was about we are learning to ask and answer questions about habits and routines. Okay, but what about the WILF here? Can anybody think about what I am learning for is about. Yeah, if you take a look at that, you might get a little bit of an idea. And if you're a teacher, if you've been a teacher for some time, this is something that I did quite a few times as well. I would often, when I would look at, for example, course book material, yeah, I would almost never start at the beginning, yeah, of that section or that unit I was looking at. I would always look at the end, yeah, and then I would work backwards. Yeah, and I think there's actually a reason for that. I mean, you get an idea of the step-by-step process much better. So if you look at the end of that page, actually 7, what I'm looking for here, so the learning outcome is, it involves the outcome and the assessment, okay? So an outcome is expressed differently here. And I think the idea here is, and I'm not sure I can actually see the objective, actually very well because my screen is covered up, but I think the objective here is to ask and answer questions. Well, that's actually the learning outcome. I'm sorry, objective. But maybe, for example, it's an informal conversation about daily activities. So you want to find out from your partner how regularly they do these everyday activities. So that's a much more concrete example of what the learning objective itself would be. Yeah, that's the outcome that you're looking at. And as a teacher, you'll often look at the end and you'll work back to see how you get there. And that's kind of the process that we're talking about. So let's look at the second idea, yeah, that's really important. Yeah, first of all, we looked at why and what we're actually assessing, but let's look at the results here, gathering information, because as I said before, we live in an information age. There is lots of data out there, and lots of ways of looking at data, and you're probably accustomed to things about, looking at how data is processed nowadays, how data is mined, and there are lots of numbers out there and lots of things like that. And this can be quite useful as well for teaching. But let's go back to probably the easiest and the most basic and one of the most useful ways to gather information, which is simply by questioning your students. Yeah? And we're taught to do this as teachers. This is something we're taught from the very beginning, that the way to question our students in order to check things with them, yeah? So for example here, if we're teaching this particular grammar point, yeah, this grammar point is an enabling type of grammar point. This grammar point of the present simple is going to help them to do certain types of things. But this question here, when do we use the present simple, may not be a very good question to ask students. It's a very kind of meta-language type focused question. Maybe they don't have a concept of that, so maybe we don't really want to ask them that question. Some students might get it, yeah, because they're a little bit more studious. They like to read the book and they like to look at all the things there, all the information there. But other students don't learn that way, maybe, and I think a lot of people, it's better to sort of check the concept in another way. So you might rephrase that question a little bit, yeah. How could you make this really more effective? So the idea here is by using the objective itself. And you see here the objective, I mean, we have a grammar point with the present simple questions and answers, but it says, I can ask and answer questions about habits and routines. So a better question to ask here would be something if we use the learning objective, a better question would be this: when does John play tennis? And then somebody says every day. And obviously then you say, okay, so every day, if you do something every day, it's a habit, it's a routine. So you're checking the concept. This is quite important, actually, because this really points to the idea of the entire communicative approach of language teaching. There was a time when there was a grammar-based approach, a grammar syllabus, and we would teach grammar points, simply grammar points. But we now live in an age where we use descriptors, where we use learning objectives, and the idea there is quite different. It's where we establish meaning, yeah, before we look at form. And years and years and years ago, it actually used to be the other way around. We used to throw out the form there and hope they understood the meaning. It's kind of grammar translation type method. And I think nowadays communicative language teaching has actually given rise to this. So this explains, I think, why learning objectives or descriptors of communicative competence eventually gained prominence over this kind of purely grammar-based syllabus, because it's much more effective for checking where your students are and if they understand a concept. Okay, so with that introduction there, I think I'm going to then pass this over to Elena, who's going to finish off with a lot of interesting and practical ideas as well, I think, for your classes. So Elena, if you'd like to take over now.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, thank you, Brian. All right, so we continue with the idea of gathering information. Okay, Brian talked about asking questions, which is probably the easiest or the commonest way of gathering information. Something else we could do is have something more like a visual thing. Okay, so this is what I call the achievement board that you can have on the wall. So you can use any of the learning objectives from the course book. For instance, we can have the vocabulary objective, which is to talk about cultural activities, likes and dislikes. Okay, you have your objective there. And then you have 3 envelopes, which contain 3 different pieces in 3 different colors. So, well, you can imagine this is representing a traffic light. So the red one is probably something bad, and the one in yellow it's middle, and green is good. Okay, so the students, they read the objective, and they're going to pick the color they think that describes them better. So I don't understand in red. Okay, if they feel they kind of get it, but still need some practice or some extra help, they can get the yellow piece, and then the green one is if they feel confident. Okay, so after they all post their piece on the board, and this is good for them and for you. To gather information about how the class is understanding this specific concept or idea or skill or whatever you're teaching, okay, or that lesson. And this is really, really good because it's very visual, and well, it's something you could do, okay? So this is the analogic way of doing it, but I'm sure you know there are other digital and maybe more efficient ways of gathering information and also getting this kind of information. Okay, so I'm going to show you a digital tool. We have a Pearson. Okay, it's called My English Lab. So here, the students they've done their homework, okay, their activities, and they've received a grade, as you can see here. So 2%, 78. Etc. Okay, but as a teacher, and also the students see this, okay, each student see their grades, of course. You can have a color-coded type of grade book, so it's also very visual to see if there are any problems in the class. And also the good thing about this is that you have a summary at the bottom. I'm sure you can see it. Okay, summary says it's 43%. It's giving you a number, but also color. So in this case, it's orange, and orange in the traffic lights is not very good. Okay, so this type of information you're gathering from your students is very good because that's going to tell you whether you need to do something about it in your classes, whether you need to modify your teaching, if you need to recycle some kind of concept. Okay, so that's good. And one more benefit you can get from digital tools is the common error report. Okay, so apart from giving you the numbers, okay, and the colors, they're telling you what are the main errors in your classes. Okay, so after the students have done different activities, you can get this kind of feedback. Okay, and if we look at the exercise number 1, when it says grammar, okay, let's see, it says working, that was the right answer, okay, in green, and work, that's what 7 students chose, and that's wrong. Okay, so if you look at this, it can give you a clear idea of what's going on in this class. So there are 7 students out of, I don't know how many, I think probably 15, okay, that they have problems to understand the difference between the present simple and the present continuous. Okay, so maybe you need to do something about it. And this is really, really useful because we could obviously do that in class too. Okay, after we correct some some writings or some tests, we could have a list of the common errors, but it's easier if there is a digital tool that is giving us this information. Okay, it's going to save us a lot of time. Okay, more ways to gather information. Well, this is something we all do, is through tests. They could be during the course. Okay, they could be throughout the course. For example, review pages at the end of the unit, or you could give them at the end of a year, for instance. Or you could be, if you're focusing on testing your student on grammar, you could just have a test on grammar, or on skills, or on vocabulary. So there are many different types of tests you could give to your students. Okay. And also, back to what Brian was saying about questions. Okay, questions are an effective way of gathering information, but sometimes I found that, especially teenagers, they like to spot mistakes. So it's good if, as a teacher, sometimes you make false statements so that students, tell you, teacher, that's not what you need to do, or you need to say. For example, if I say, I want to know how regularly Mike plays football, I will ask, are you playing football? And I'm sure there'll be some students who are going to prove you wrong, okay, and are going to say, well, that's not the right way of asking it, teacher. Okay, that's wrong. And I think it's an effective way of gathering information and see if they really understood what you were explaining. Okay, in this case, this grammar point. Okay, good. All right, so we said we basically today we're going to talk about what and why assessing is important. Okay, then gather information. And then number 3, which I don't know if you remember. Okay, but let me see. So number 3, okay, it's a very important point. If we look at this interesting study conducted by John Hattie, it was done 5 years ago. It was a meta study about different factors that affected learning. Okay, and you can see the list here. And it was a meta study. He did in over 800. He did over 800 studies. Okay, and he covered around 80 million students. So it's a big one, okay, with a big sample. So he saw that, for instance, let's see, student motivation, number 7, was there, okay, but that was still number 7. And that's interesting to see, because, well, for us, well, I think, at least for me, motivation should be on the top 3. Okay, but maybe that's not the case. Okay, or number 12, that's interesting. In Spain, for instance, homework. There's been a lot of discussion and controversy around homework in Spain lately, because parents they have started to complain about the amount of homework that teachers give to their students. Okay, and this is interesting because they don't see homework as an effective tool for learning, but it's there. It's number 12. Okay, good. So number 1, discover. Yeah. So what do you think number 1 factor is affecting learning? I'm sure you know. Okay, it is feedback. Okay, feedback is number one affecting learning. So that's why we're going to talk about using feedback effectively. All right? Yeah, so we've gathered information, and now what do we do with it? Okay. Well, this obviously involves giving feedback to students. Okay, you give feedback to students. We talked about giving them a numerical value. Okay, so we can give them a 6 out of 10. But what happens with this? Well, as soon as you see their grades, okay, look at it, compare to each other, and that's it. I mean, we're not telling them what's right, what's wrong, or how can we help them to improve. Okay, that's why there are some researchers who said that comments are really powerful if we want our students to improve. Okay, so we have a comment here. Use different describing words for very good, what about wonderful, and fantastic. Okay, but instead of having this as a dichotomy, okay, they said in their studies that it is more powerful if we give them a number and the comment, so both together, okay? But we need to be careful with comments. Also, sometimes we know that students don't read comments. Why? Because maybe we're not giving them the right comments, okay? Sometimes we're just like, very good, good job, I don't like it, for instance, okay? But those are not the right comments to give to our students, okay? So what kind of comments should we provide? Well, we need comments that help our learners to move forward, okay, and to make our learners think. And this step about thinking, reflection, is going to be something we'll talk about later, and it's really important, okay, because that's really going to help our learners to become autonomous learners. Okay, thinking, reflecting. Okay, if we continue talking about comments and we go back to the idea of using digital tools, another benefit we can get from these tools, from these learning management systems, are the type of comments we or the students can get. Okay, so as you can see here, the type of comments for a wrong answer are really good. Okay, because if you read it, you need to use a word that means to pat gently. So it's giving the student some clues on how to make it right. Okay, it's not just wrong, think about it twice, or other type of comments which are not very productive. Okay, so you need to give your students clues, but not only with wrong answers. Okay, it's also important that we give comments on right answers. In this case, for example, when done, we use present simple for something which is always or generally true. This is interesting, especially if we're not really sure if the students just, chose the answer just, randomly. Okay, so it's good to remind them why it's right. And like I said before, I mean, teachers don't have much time to write comments for students to every single task. Okay, it's time consuming, so obviously you can't do this all the time for every task and throughout the whole year. So that's why if you're using any kind of digital tool, that this is going to help you a lot. Okay, it's going to save a lot of time. Good. Something you could do with comments, and I think this is very interesting, and this again relates to the students' thinking. Okay, is that, okay, you've got a piece of writing, for example, the one on the right, okay, with some mistakes, as you can probably see. And what we normally do, okay, we have the piece of paper with the writing, and we just write comments next to the problem. Okay, but something you could do is just have a list on the left-hand side of all the comments, okay, and tell your students to match the comment to the problem. So, for example, a few words are misspelled. So the students can match it to the writing, and we've got here 15, for instance, okay, or favorite, etc. Okay, so they're doing some kind of reflection already. Okay, more ways of giving feedback to students. Rubrics. This is something, at least in Spain, we use a lot, especially in public schools. Okay, and why are rubrics important? Well, it's telling the students what they need to do, what they need to improve, okay, and also what they need to do for the task. And it's also telling you how the learners did, okay. So you can get some rubrics from course books nowadays, okay, but you can also find them online. This one that you can see here with the hamburger, I really like it. You know, it's really visual, and your students might like it too. I took it from Pinterest, and sometimes you can just download rubrics that other teachers created, and you can modify them. All right, and another tool online you can find is the one in purple, Rubrics. Okay, this is just simply going to convert the rubric score into a percentage, because you know the scores are just normally 4, 3, 2, 1, and then when you add them up, it's like, I don't know, 20 or something. All right, and you need a percentage. Okay, so what do we need to include in a rubric? Well, if we're talking about writing, okay, for example, this task, you're making your own website and need to write a personal introduction about yourself. Write the personal introduction about yourself in the next column. And then there are some things that you need to include, okay? You need to talk about yourself and your family, etc. Normally, when we assess a piece of writing, what do we assess? Well, content, right? Task achievement, organization and structure, range, and accuracy. Okay, I took this from the Wider World book for the A2 level, and because it includes some rubrics for you to use. And this is something that it's general, okay, that we normally do. Okay, but like I said before, okay, the rubric is a really useful type of information. Okay, I took the one relating to organization. So the first column on the left, right? It's number 4. Okay, the rubric is divided in 4 different bands. Number 4 is the highest. So number 4 is going to tell you what you are assessing, okay, or what the students need to do. And I think it's a good idea if you actually share this with your students. Okay, you give them the highest band of the rubric, and you say, okay, this is what I'm looking for here on this writing. So for content, I need this. For grammar or accuracy, I need this. For organization, this. Okay. The second column is it's number 2 of the bands. Okay, so it's kind of in the middle. So it's telling you, and it's telling the students what they need to improve. So there is no organization regarding genre, or it's the text is organized at the phrase or sentence level. There's no linking, so it's giving the students clues on what they need to do to fix those problems. Okay, good. All right, so we have given feedback to our students, and now we need them to react to feedback. Well, why? We already talked about this idea of conversation between us and our students. And when students react to feedback, there is a kind of reflection process that is going to help them a lot. Okay, so this part is really, really important. If you remember this type of gather information, we saw this, the achievement board, yeah? Okay, so what you can do is just point it out, okay, and talk about it in class. So you can start a conversation with your students from here, okay? You can look at it, all of you, and then your students can tell you their perceptions about this specific task or objective, how they feel about it. So what is it that they don't understand? Or what is it that they do understand? What is it that they like about this lesson? Okay, so you can just have an informal conversation about it. Okay, just so it's a way of getting feedback from your students too, but at the same time they will be reflecting on it. Okay. Another way of getting your students to think over results, okay, or feedback is self-assessment. Okay. So normally, what we give our students is checklists. Here, you can see could be a very simple checklist in which your students have to draw a smiley face next to the lesson and how they feel about it. Okay, I understand, or I don't, so it's similar to the traffic light we saw. But I think the important thing here is the type of remediation that you're giving to your students. So next to your checklist, or I mean next to the students' checklist, I think it's necessary to provide them with the tools they need if they want to improve. Okay, in this case, this was taken from the workbook, from the wider world. So you can see there's a checklist, and then what type of activities they can do to practice a little bit more, okay, and to fix those problems. Another type of checklist, which is a different type of checklist, this is also taken from the workbook, is connecting the classroom to real life. This is something sometimes we forget to do, and I think it's really necessary that students understand the link between what they do in the class and what they do out of the class. Okay, and they can see a real purpose for learning. Okay, in this case, we're talking about vocabulary. So first, you say, okay, new words I learned. So this is learning. They create a list. But after, you're talking about something more emotional, okay? So expressions and phrases that I liked. Now you're talking about likes, okay? Less threatening. And then you're talking about English I heard or read outside class. So there they can see the connection here between class and outside of the class. And this is probably going to be engaging and motivating, because I'm sure they're going to try to find ways of using or listening to English outside of class, okay, or reading English, okay. All right, another way of students reacting to feedback, okay, it's a learning portfolio. This case, we're talking about writing. What we normally do with writing portfolios is we tell our students, okay, now you're going to keep your writings, the ones you did throughout the course, you keep them in a folder. But that's not enough, okay? We need to make our learners think about what they did, okay? So something we could do, okay, here you have some tips, is they can write a final note explaining how they see their progress. Okay, or they can tell you what they think they need to improve. Or they can tell you what they think is the best piece of work and why. Okay, so not only looking at the things they did wrong, okay, but we also need to try to create this positive atmosphere. You can also give them the chance to improve their worst piece of writing, okay, or even better, you can tell them to select or choose their best piece of writing and make it public. So maybe if you have a blog in your classroom or something like that, or like a learning management system in your schools, they can do that. Okay, you can talk to other departments, you can talk to the school and make it public, and they'll feel proud about it and think about it, and maybe they will want to improve it, even if it's the best piece of writing. If they want to make it public, okay, they want to improve it. All right, something else they could do, okay, to reflect on their learning and on the feedback, okay, is to write, okay, the problems they still have on a piece of paper and put it in a box, the confusion box. Okay, so this is a non-threatening way of reflecting, okay, or your students giving you feedback about how they feel, because you want to know who wrote that, okay, and this is something you could just have in your class and just draw one piece of paper from time to time, and you can answer the question, or even better, you can have somebody else answer the question. Okay, one who knows the answer, obviously. And this is an important step, but also we need to teach our students how to write questions. Okay, I think at least here in Spain, it's hard for the students to know how to ask questions, and this is something they could learn too from this type of activity. Okay, learning to write questions. Okay, asking the right questions. Okay, so for example, what's the difference between fathers and parents? Why can't we say this and that? How do you pronounce, etc.? Okay, good. Now, another type of reflecting, okay, is peer assessment. So we can give our students a piece of writing, or even, just different sentences taken from different writings, okay, and we can tell our students to be the writing critics. Well, this is like the food critic. And I think this works very nice with teenagers. They love spotting mistakes, like I said before, with the false statements. They're better at spotting mistakes of somebody else than their own. Okay, so if you tell them there are some mistakes here, I'm sure they want to analyze it and say, oh, this is wrong, this is also wrong. Okay. So if you don't want one piece of writing, like the whole thing, so that this person might feel a little bit frustrated, you can just have different sentences, like I said before, from different writings. Okay. Something else you could do, something fun, it's voting. Okay, voting for the best piece of writing or the best piece of speaking. Okay, so this is something that I did with my adult students. Okay, I used Padlet. I don't know if you're familiar with this tool, but if not, it's very easy to use, and you can find a lot of tutorials online. Okay, just go to YouTube and just type Padlet tutorial. Okay. So I uploaded a video as a model of what the students needed to do. and they had to explain some piece of news, okay? And then they did the same. And after, they had to vote for the funniest, okay, the most original, and the best, okay? So when you tell your students that they're going to be voted, this is going to motivate them to make it better. And also, if it's like here, kind of online, kind of, well, it's not public because it's in your class. You can make this private to your class, okay? But if they know they're being watched, observed by other classmates, they're going to try to make it better, and they're being recorded in this case, okay? You can have different types of votes. As you can see, I said the funniest, the most original, and the deepest. So in this case, we're not talking about accuracy, or we're not talking about grammar or vocabulary, but you could also add other types, okay? You could also say, okay, the one with the best vocabulary, or the one with the best grammar or structure or whatever. So there are many items you could consider here. Okay. Nice. So we've given feedback to our students. Our students have reacted to the feedback, so they kind of reflected on what they did. Okay, and now you're going to adjust your teaching. Okay. So, well, these are 3 simple ways of modifying your teaching. So if you think that there are still ways, there are still concepts that your students don't understand, well, what can you do? Just recycle content. That's very important. Sometimes we just do a lesson, we do a unit, we forget about it, okay? And we don't care how our students are feeling about it. So we need to recycle continuously. Or we can have other students, there is something still which is not very clear. We can have students helping each other. So for example, one student is good at grammar, okay? So this person can help another student who's good at vocabulary, for instance, okay? And that's a kind of cooperative learning. And we can also, like I said, assign more homework, could be paper or online, okay, to help them. And finally, we can do a recheck. Okay, so after we have modified our teaching, we can recheck that they learned. Here, it could be, well, it would be just impossible to go back again and give them more feedback, more comments, more correcting, okay, more grading to our students. That would be the never ending story, okay? So we can just have informal checks, okay? Something you could do is you could buy mini whiteboards for your students, but I know this could be expensive. So that's why you could also use laminated flashcards. You ask a question to your class. For instance, this person makes films and tells actors what to do. The students write their answers, director, okay, and they show it to you. Nobody else can see what they wrote, okay, just you. And again, it's a very clear picture of what your students understood. Okay. Or even better, if you want a kind of peer assessment, you can have the class in 2 halves, ask the question, and then they show it to each other, and they can see whose team is better, for instance. You can make it a competition. You can also use games such as this one, which is very old, Jeopardy. I love games. I love this one. Okay. I'm sure you know how it works, but if not, these are different categories. For instance, the first column would be vocabulary, second one is grammar, third one is general culture, whatever. And then $200 questions will be easier than $1,000 questions. So you have them here, and then you ask your students, okay, just give me a category and a number, okay, or money, and then you just pick it, and they earn the money, and well, it's cool, and you can do this from time to time. And also you can use technology, and I'm going to go into detail on this, but these are different ways of getting feedback from your students to see if they understood. These are kind of quizzes, and then your students just give you the answer, and you can see whether they understood or not. Kahoot is really, really popular here in Spain, and I'm sure in your countries too. Then quizzes, it's similar to Kahoot, and then we've got Plickers and Socrative. Again, if you go to YouTube and you just type in tutorial Kahoot or Plickers, and you find a good tutorial, this is kind of easy to understand. Again, you can apply them to your classes. Concluding remarks. I hope you're still here. Okay. Well, we've looked at these three main things that involved other minor but also important things. We've been looking at what assessment is first, and why and what assessing is important, understanding it. Okay, that was when Brian was explaining this. Okay, we've also seen some ways of gathering information. Okay, collecting information from our students, and then using feedback effectively. So not only giving our students feedback, and not only telling them what they need to do and what is right and what is wrong, but moving a little bit a step farther, okay, and making them think about their mistakes. Okay, this part of reflection, which I think is very important, because this is going to help them to become autonomous learners, and I think this is what is going to help them in the future, in fact. Okay, good. So these are the references that we used, the two studies that we mentioned. Okay, the course book, we use Wider World, A2 level. Okay. And well, here there's a link to the tutorials for these tools. But again, you just go to YouTube and type in tutorial, whatever, Plickers, and you'll find it. Okay. So thank you, everybody. I think, well, I hope you liked the webinar, and I think this is a time for questions. I don't know if we have any questions. Maybe Brian can pop in again and see if we can both answer questions. Yeah, he's there. Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks very much. That was brilliant. We've just got the one question, so we're just going to ask the one because it's people probably want to get on because it's like in the afternoon now, so they might want to go home. So the question was, should we assess students' errors and mistakes?
Yeah, it was. That's actually a very good question. There's sometimes a distinction made between mistakes and errors. It could be important to talk about, and it depends on how you define these terms, but a mistake is often a deviation in language that occurs when someone does not perform to their competence, so there's a level of competence, whereas an error is often considered something, a deviation in language which results from a lack of knowledge of the correct rule. So in one case, you should know the rule. It should be at your level of competence, but you don't apply it. That would be a mistake. And an error, for example, would be that you just don't know the rule. I think the important thing here to know is if you should know the rule or not, what level of competence the student is at. So you can kind of think, for example, if a student is making a certain error, is that an error that they should know at this level? Is it an error that they should be learning more or less right now, but maybe they haven't quite got yet? Or is it something that's way of advanced for them. Yeah, if it's way too advanced for them, maybe it's not something you need to be worried about correcting. But it's something they should know, or something that they're in process of knowing, of getting to know, getting to understand. Then maybe you should correct it. And I think here, for example, when we talked before about scales and things, the Common European Framework of Reference or the Global Scale of English, for example, the Global Scale of English tells you exactly where those competencies or where those learning objectives should be in different at different stages of competence. So that's a tool that those types of tools are things that you should be using if you want to create things like rubrics or if you want to create a syllabus for your class. So if you wanted to actually look at something like that, if you go to English.com and you take a look at the Global Scale of English or the Teacher Toolkit, for example. The Teacher Toolkit is a way of accessing the Global Scale of English, and you can actually define an area, for example, A2, and you can take a look at, for different skills or for grammar or vocabulary, you can actually take a look at the things a student should know at that area of their learning. And that's a good way of finding out if you need to be correcting it or not, for example.
That's great, Brian. Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Brian and Elena, for that great webinar. Thank you, everyone who attended. As we said at the beginning, you'll get your certificates and your recordings in due course. And also, we have another 2 webinars tomorrow and a final one on Saturday. So if you'd like to join those, please go on the website. The links are there, and register. You still have plenty of time to do so. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thanks for coming.